Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations about Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and I am delighted, as always, to be joined by Anthony Tresca.
Hey there!
This is a podcast devoted to thoughtful discussions about that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we are so excited to have you join us for today's episode over 1987's A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors.
Yeah, I feel like it does need like a Eye of the Tiger introduction to anything that's going to have the phrase Dream Warriors.
Yeah, we need to get like a trailer voice person in here.
We really do.
To just like spice it up, add the drama.
Because it really needs drama that your voice just clearly can't capture on its own. I'm so glad we're working our way through this franchise. I don't know why it took us so long to do so.
In our defense, there's a lot of horror movies and even a lot of horror franchises. Although I think I do agree with you. It's frustrating it took us so long, particularly when you forced me to do Halloween.
That is true. Although I only force you to do one a year, so that feels super manageable. But yes, as we're working our way through the franchise, I'm just reminded watching it sort of sequentially, because it feels like I watch a lot of these ones like out of order, just randomly on their own. Just watching the larger narrative unfold has been really interesting, especially because I'd never seen 2, and I had seen 3 several times. So that was kind of an interesting new experience to watch Dream Warriors in light of Freddy's Revenge.
Yeah, Dream Warriors is a very interesting movie it's very interesting by itself, of course, but it's also interesting in where it falls in the Nightmare franchise, because this is the first Nightmare with Wes Craven back in some way. He's just writing this time around, but it is a turn from he did not want to work on the sequel because he did not want Nightmare to be a franchise. But he came back for this one because he thought that this was going to be the final film in the franchise. But then, because this was successful, obviously that meant that the franchise had to continue because capitalism must capitalism. So,
Yeah. And it's interesting because one of the things that I like is sort of seeing how the things that Craven wanted, he gets to, but it just takes him a really long time, right? Like, he wanted this one to be even more meta, and he was like, okay, hold on, we will return to this eventually. And then, of course, we do with a new Nightmare.
Yeah, the original draft that Craven wrote for this one was what he ultimately ended up getting to make with A New Nightmare years later. It's certainly, this is very interesting for many, many reasons.
Yeah, I don't even know if I am sure where to begin, because I feel like I have so many thoughts. So why don't you guide us? Where would you like to start our conversation first?
Well, I think that A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 has to answer a unique question that is unique for horror slasher sequels, or at least the ones that include the final girl from a previous entry, and that's what to do with the final girl who has previously achieved, and I know you're going to hate this, but the phallic. What do you do once the final girl is back, but they've already achieved the phallus? And that's what this movie has to deal with.
I will make that sound every time you say that word, just to let you know. I can't, it's involuntary. But I think you're absolutely correct. I'm glad you started there. Because I feel like Nightmare as a franchise answers this question very, very differently than our other franchises do. With Halloween, if we are supposed to ignore all the films that were made between the original and the 2018 as the franchise wants us to do, right? At the very least, she's really, really scarred. But if we sort of keep the other films that exist, regardless of whether they want us to think of them.
Yeah, they got made. And
they got made. They're part of my memory, right?
And they were even intended to be a part of the Halloween franchise until it became inconvenient for them to be a part of the Halloween franchise.
Exactly. Again, it's sort of that story of trauma, right? And of being scarred. What I like about Nightmare is that it feels like, instead of it just being, but wait, we're going to traumatize our person some more. It's more, I don't know, Heather has more agency because she's making this decision to use her experience to help others. And it doesn't feel, she puts herself into danger intentionally in a way that I feel like a lot of the other franchises with our final girls are just like, oops, guess you're never escaping this.
Yeah. Although I will kind of push back on it, because the film does kind of, before it can get to that, which is what is the good stuff it does with Nancy, it does kind of, and I don't know if this is a real phrase or if I'm just making this up, but de-phallic Nancy, because it pairs her with this older, grizzled member of the patriarchy, who initially doesn't believe her. She loses her power, the power of the phallic, so to speak, to achieve this, to continue this absolutely disgusting metaphor.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
So at the start of Dream Warrior, she has the phallic, but it's not recognized. And so she has to go through a recognition period to achieve the phallic again. So the film does kind of de-phallic her at the start, at least.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because it does, and yet again, it doesn't quite, right? Because there's that line where, what is his name? You called him grizzly and old, but he's not that old.
I said older, or maybe I did say old. I don't remember. Neil?
Thank you.
Neil Gordon.
So Niels says something along the lines of, like, why are we treating this person who's barely out of school with prestige when I've been working with these people for, like, ever? But we know why she's been chosen, right? So there's an interesting way in which, on the one hand, I think you're right, that we have to, like, watch her go back through the hero's journey, if you will, and to sort of reclaim, I'm not going to say it, I just don't want to reclaim her power. But at the same time, the film is also telling us that there's a discrepancy between what the system sees to be the truth and what we already, as the audience, know to be the truth.
It definitely contributes to this overall conversation that the film wants to have about, like, faith versus reason, faith versus science, whatever you want to call it. And the audience already has the faith that Nancy's the right choice, because we've seen the previous nightmares. We know that this Freddy Krueger guy is real because we've seen it. We have faith. The audience does. But within the context of the story world that we're being presented, it does, at least for the first act, choose to take away Nancy's power, and which is an interesting choice, even if it does ultimately restore her power to her by the start of the second act.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's a good point because I think it reveals the larger sort of magic for me of all the Nightmare films, and that is that. And this doesn't sound like it should be a good thing, but it's a contradictory text, right? It's a text that's often doing something different from in the narrative than it's doing from the experience of engaging with the narrative. And this example of Heather is such a good one in this particular film, because of course at the end, she also, if we're gonna keep going there, she gets phallicked, right? She gets stabbed there at the end by Freddy, who's not just Freddy, but once again her father, right? We're returning back to, like, it can't get much more sort of Electra, as the opposite of the Oedipal complex. It can't get much more Electra in terms of the, like, she's so excited because her dad's like, I just want you to know I love you, honey, and then he impales her with his knives because it's really Freddy. So again, if we can read Heather as this really strong character for so much of the film, she's also not our final girl, not at the end, and that's a confusing thing to do, because this film really likes to confuse us about whether or not we're supposed to celebrate and how we're supposed to celebrate the people that are remaining alive at the end. Can we go back to Neil, though, for a second?
Yeah, sure. What about Neil?
Yeah, so watching it this time around, I think I was creeped out a little bit more by Neil, because this time around, and I'm not sure if I could tell you why I felt this way, but it just felt so much more romantic in terms of, you know, and of course it wasn't just romantic because it was also fatherly, and I just felt icky in a way that I don't remember feeling last time, and I don't know if it's just because this time around I saw Neil as a bigger character, and previously I really focused more on the teens. I'm not sure what it is, but I just want to say that this film does such a good job of taking these relationships, these paternal relationships, and like making us really uncomfortable in these spaces. Whether we're uncomfortable because we realize that our father figure, who's also, you know, the cop, can't protect us, or because it's like, you know, he's just a little too close to his protege, a little too trusting. I don't know. It's just something about it really bothered me this time. How do you read it, as being this weirdly romantic?
Yeah, I definitely got it. Was very like sexual, but not in an, you're right, not in an overt way. Like they like just the way that they would like position them when they were at dinner, and like the lighting, the mood lighting that they would kind of use with them at any time, and they were just very close. And I mean, obviously he's kind of like touchy in a way that has gone out of style now, to say the least. So, I think it's in there.
But, like, that final scene between him and the dad when they're in the junkyard, it felt very, and this is a little bit of a stretch, I realize, but it felt very, like, who gives away this woman, right? Moment of the, like, wedding ceremony, where it was, like, this weird tussle for who gets to be the protector of Heather. And meanwhile, Heather's clearly just doing fine, protecting herself. And I think that's what I found so disturbing, is that I feel like Nightmare has done this for me, you know, in 3 films so far, and I assume it'll continue on as we watch the films later, but this awareness that, like, there's something really inherently icky about this patriarchal system, because if we focus on the people that are being, quote, protected in the system, children, women, particularly female children, we realize that those are the ones that are either not being protected at all or don't need the protection. And I just find it really interesting how this film puts that into this narrative that is ultimately a slasher film, right? That's all about sort of the patriarchy.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a new source of horror, like you're saying. This kind of anti-institutional, anti-status quo is a commonality throughout these 3 Nightmare films that we've gotten to so far. And in this one, it's really interesting, I think, that they choose to extend their anti-institution critique to the medical professionals, that is a new area for the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, because, I mean, the first movie, it's like, cops are bad, because, I mean, the chief of police can't even protect his daughter. Like, that's how bad it is. It's clear. Like, I guess the second one is far more about the educational system, and it's kind of just about, like, the closed-mindedness that's present in there. And then this one is about the medical industry, and, I mean, psychology and mental health. And that's interesting.
Yeah, we get that really tiny snippet in one where they're trying to do the test, the dream test, right, on Nancy. I said Heather earlier. Oops. Nancy. But you're right, that this is the one that focuses more exclusively on this. And one of the things that I think is lovely about this film, and that is very different from a lot of films, horror films that give us introductions or examinations of particularly mental health, is that I don't feel like this was condemning at all the mentally ill people.
No.
Right?
No, it's clearly the source of horror is not the fact that they have mental illnesses, which
exactly
so often, like you were alluding to, that's what's scary in horror films. It's just like, oh, look at the mentally ill over there. It's just like it's a cheap way to evoke horror.
It's an easy way to build in a monster, right?
Yeah.
Like, who is monstrous, those that are different from us, who's different from us, the mentally ill. Whereas this one, first, I think, gave us a wide range of characters, right? We got to see a whole bunch of different reasons that these teenagers were in this place. And never once do I think it made us feel like, oh, well, they deserve it, but they are monstrous themselves, right?
Yeah, the source of horror is that society and these systems are not believing the pains and feelings of those with mentally ill.
Exactly.
It's really tapping into this fear that you talk about, that you have personally, of like you say something is going to happen, but nobody believes you. And that's what's happening. And I mean, society just has no idea what to do with people who are mentally ill. And so when they say something's happening in their head, they already are inclined not to believe you. And this film just shows the extent of what can happen when you don't believe those who are telling you something is wrong.
And what I appreciated is that this film never went as far as it could have, or as far as many films have, in terms of showing like actual abuse in the system. So one of the things I really liked is, you know, Lawrence Fishburne's delivery as Max Daniels, because he's doing tough love, but he's not abusive, right? And a lot of times if we see the medical industry as bad, it's, you know, actual like physical or sexual or mental abuse. Instead, it was just like you said, it was neglect. It was a refusal to acknowledge the disenfranchised. And it was also a refusal to be progressive, right? Because if they had gone with that experimental medication, some things would have been better. So it was really interesting to see how this film, like you said, is condemning yet another part of what makes up the patriarchy.
Yeah, it's this medical profession that's filled with and shaped by and for those in power, which as is in our society, the patriarchal elites. And so, I mean, it just basically says, like, the medical professionals are all fools, except for the outsider Nancy, who knows the truth.
Exactly, who knows the truth, and knows the truth not because of her formal education, but again, because of her personal experience.
It's all about faith over reason and action over understanding, which is, in another way, if you want to, something else that it's critiquing is it's very much critiquing intellectuals like us. I would probably say, like, this podcast, because, like, it doesn't necessarily care if you can understand something, verbalize it, rationalize it, if you don't take any real action to stop the problem.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And we see that particularly, I think, as Neil begins to make the transition to believing Nancy, and also his sort of confrontations with the head nurse, right, who is overseeing the patients and like reports Neil and Nancy sort of, admittedly, it's not wise to just like see what happens with group therapy, but you know, I mean, she just immediately reports it. And so we get this, one of our villains, if you will, in addition to Freddy, are the people who are refusing to look at anything but the intellectual side of things, and what the evidence is showing.
And what has already been established. Like you said earlier, they're not able to progress because they're not willing to do anything that would progress forward. They only want to do what they know has worked in the past, which in this situation isn't going to work because nobody has had to deal with Freddy in the past.
Exactly. And is never going to work as long as they don't listen to the group of people who are being ignored, right? So I think it's important that when we think about a group of teens, you know, Nancy describes them as being the last of the Elm Street kids, but we have someone in a wheelchair, we have someone who doesn't speak, we have someone who's the sort of like, quote, bad boy figure, we have an addict, we have someone who's obsessed with TV, we have a black person, right? We have all of these groups of people that we have been taught are not the voices we should be listening to, right? Or not the people that we should be hearing. We have the, you know, rich white girl, right? We have all of these like categories, and it's interesting to see how the film is saying, wait a minute, it is very possible that these are the group of people that can tell you about the true horrors, right, that are being experienced, and certainly can tell you about their experiences, right? No other voice can capture your trauma except for you. And that's a really rather profound message for a third film in a franchise to be trying to tackle.
It really relates to there are a lot of theorists who postulate that those who are neurodivergent or are mentally, what society deems as mentally ill, are actually those who see the problems of society most clearly and refuse to just blindly conform and accept the rules of society. And I really think that is the approach that Nightmare 3 is taking. It is saying that perhaps these are not the most broken. Perhaps the most broken is the system and those who just tacitly uphold it without actually critically thinking about it.
What I like about what you said, lots of things. I like all of it. But I like the fact that what you're describing also allows the element about Sister Helena / Amanda Kruger to make sense, right? Because if we're seeing this as those that don't see the system the same way everyone else does can see something truer than those trapped in the system, that not only is going to describe those that we've claimed to have mental illness, it's also going to refer to people that are religious, right? Because they are by definition choosing to be outside the world, right? That is part of the Christian creed, is to be not of this world, right? And so there's a really interesting way in which this film is giving a voice to the voices that are often pushed to the margins, and saying that it's just as much those that are mentally ill as it is those that are religious, or, to go back to your earlier argument, those that have faith.
Yeah, the nun, whom is Freddy Krueger's mother, in a big old... I mean, it's about as obvious of a twist as any. I mean, you can see it coming from miles away. As soon as they showed up, I was like, oh, that's the mom. But, that aside, the nun tells Neil, if your only faith is science, doctor, it may be you that is laid to rest. And I think that's really commenting on how science is being used interchangeably here for those who just value empirical hard evidence, just the things in the objective that you can plainly see, facts and figures. This overvaluing of that and devaluing of individual experience, what's actually going on right in front of you, evaluating the situation, because you're not able to always apply your facts and figures as well as you are one's own lived experience. And I think that applies to religious, as we're talking about. It applies to those who are experiencing their own mental illness, their own individual forms of oppression in society. So I really think, in that way, Nightmare 3 really is kind of a really good crystallization of all of the themes from the previous two Nightmare movies. And it makes a lot of sense it makes a lot of sense that this was what Wes Craven thought the end of the franchise should be.
I agree. As you were talking, it reminded me of trauma studies a little bit more explicitly, because what you're really describing is sort of the handling of a situation, right? The reflecting on it, the engaging with it, the telling of one's story, right? And claiming one's narrative, that is sort of at the heart of a lot of what the scholars of trauma theory are getting at, right? So people like Cathy Caruth, who wrote the sort of foundational text called Unclaimed Experience, Trauma Narrative and History, she looks at the fact that, trauma is not a single event. It is that event continuing to haunt us, and it's us sort of having to deal with it rearing its ugly head and needing to think about what that means. And it's also about sharing one's story. And a lot of trauma theorists are talking specifically about the Holocaust, which makes sense. And the fact that it's only through the sharing of one's narrative that you survive, right? You don't survive despite sharing your story. You survive because you haven't. And so I think you're absolutely correct that this film is really giving us that sort of perspective on things, right? That this is, okay, film one was Nancy just trying to stay alive. Mm-hmm. Film two takes such a deviation, but again, it's just about surviving in this moment. Whereas this film is really more about the trauma of the experience, right? And the trauma of being someone that is outside a safe place, right? Outside of the boundaries of being protected because your story is not being heard.
Yeah, and in this way it is different from the other two because it is a film in which every single character who is being haunted by Freddy has already previously been traumatized. Freddy is not their initial traumatic experience. Like, I mean, that is kind of the case for Nancy. I guess you could perhaps argue that the traumatic experience would be her parents' divorce, which is pretty traumatic, but
sure.
But it is not that is not true of everyone else who we see get killed in the rest of that film.
And then Nancy in film 3, her initial incident is not Freddy in that film, right? It's a prior experience with Freddy. So I think your point still stands, right? That everyone has a prior trauma before Freddy's interruption in this particular film.
Which I think is incredibly interesting, and it allows them to have a lot more interesting interactions with Freddy in the dream world. Yes. Because whereas previously, while a lot of the kills and like the stuff with Freddy in the other movies are really interesting, it does rely more on like a vague idea of what a dream is. And like, yes. Oh, this is kind of vaguely what's scary to a lot of people. This is like common things that happen in bad dreams. Whereas I think this one is really like, oh, this is what you specifically are traumatized by? Well, let me just force you to live that. Like the girl who wants to be on TV, welcome to prime time. Joey, you can't talk? You feeling tongue-tied? I'm going to wrap you up with your own little tongues. You look tired? Have a seat. That one's horrifying. That's...
Yeah. And the needles?
The needles. It's all... Yeah. It's so specific to these individuals, and it is specifically the most traumatic thing that they could be seeing, and that is why it's so good.
Yeah, I realized only fairly recently, which is rather surprising, that I actually have a minor form of trypophobia, the fear of like closely packed holes, right? And I don't like when I look at a strawberry, no biggie. When I look at a cable knit sweater, no biggie. But like bone marrow, ugh, so gross. And we get that, right? And I think you're absolutely correct, because what this film is doing is it is giving us some like very general traditional sources of fear, but it's tailoring them in a way that makes it much more terrifying. Because to be perfectly honest, I don't think Glenn in Nightmare 1's biggest fear was that he was going to be sucked into his bed, right? Like, I don't think there's nothing about his character that suggests that is something that terrifies him. Whereas what makes this particular film so haunting is exactly as you said, that we get to see the fact that what makes Nightmare so disturbing is that we have a history with them, right? Or they're touching on things that are not going to be scary for other people.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's so interesting about this movie, is that it is interested specifically in developing this idea of what dreams are. There's that really funny line that the psych nurse says when she's like, dreams are the byproduct of guilt, psychological scars stemming from moral conflicts and overt sexuality, which is hilarious. That's meta commentary. I mean, she just psychoanalyzed the previous two movies.
Yeah.
That's very funny. And then the movie, it makes that acknowledgement, but then it ultimately rejects that. It says that dreams, no, they're not byproducts of guilt. They're not abstract. Dreams are very real and tangible. And
exactly.
Because of that fact that they're real and tangible and not stemming just from byproducts of guilt and these really weighty things, I think it allows it to explore the more positive and magical elements of dreams, which is, I mean, that's pretty different from the previous Nightmare movies.
Yes. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that idea of like the magic of the dreams?
Yeah, I mean, we are not shown in the other two Nightmare films that it is possible for individuals to harness and tap into the good elements of dreams, like this idea of lucid dreaming and this importance that they can have. I mean, lucid dreaming is a huge practice in a lot of cultures because dreams are just as real to them. You spend a third of your time asleep, so this time in the dream world must mean something. That's what, or so these cultures believe, and the idea is. And so I think that's really interesting to dive into. And all of these characters, in order to defeat Freddy, have to take control and agency of this kind of nightmarish world. What seems to be a nightmare at first.
Which makes the title so fitting, right? Because unlike, I think, 1 and 2, which are much more about sort of being caught in things, right? There is a larger degree of agency in this one, because we see them being able to stand, being, quote, beautiful, being strong, having their voice. And I think you're absolutely correct that what this film does is it, 1, showed us that nightmares are scary. 2, showed us that we can never quite know if we're in reality or nightmares. But 3 shows us, like you said, the power for good and ill of the dreamscape. And that's really interesting.
And I think it is really interesting because it's also a rejection of this idea that things can only be one thing or another. This rejection of dualism, which is another idea that is dominant in the status quo. Dualism, it's this idea that there can only be one thing or the other. Things are either black or white, good or bad, and you see that seeped into a lot of individuals' mindset, as well as that's how systems and institutions are set up, with this either black or white approach. And this film is like, no. Things are not either good or bad. Things are so much more nuanced than that. And it is a lot of times what you bring to it that colors what that unique situation is going to be. It's not this overly simplified good, bad, nightmare, happy dream. It is what you make.
And what makes the Nightmare series so powerful is its awareness of this on sort of a meta level. So a lot of horror really thrives on creating dichotomies, right? There's the monster that's outside, and then there's us humans inside. And yet, where the interesting horror lies, right, is in this liminal space where it's like, but is it either or, right? And so like Jeffrey Jerome Cohen talks about the fact that monsters are not about either or, they're about sort of this yes and of course a good example is zombies. Are they human or other? And it's like, well, yeah. And I think slasher films try really, really hard to enforce as a general rule this dichotomy, but as even people like Carol Clover said, our final girl is herself this thing that is supposed to be this female figure, but also one that is identifiable for the male audiences. And I think Nightmare, out of all the horror franchises that I can think of, just other than like Evil Dead, which is also parodying things, just says straight out, we cannot live in this either or world. That doesn't make any sense. The reality is that we are always a little bit in the real world and a little bit in the dream world. We are always a little bit our own worst monster and the hero of our narrative. And this film and it really just explicitly makes that point in a way that almost makes you wish that it was the end of the franchise. Not but then we wouldn't have the other films. But just there's so much that this film is sort of ending the conversation on that's really just fascinating.
Yeah, because and speaking to the conclusivity of this film, I don't know if that's a real word. Conclusivity? What is that?
I don't think it is, but it is now. I mean,
speaking to the conclusivity of the film,
yes,
it does really wrap up in a nice bow. I mean, the whole thing is about like children. This is a source of horror throughout these 3 films, is that children pay for the sins of their parents, and that source of horror. I don't think I've seen any other nightmares past this, so I'll be shocked if that source of horror pops up again, because I don't know how they could do it again, because they've buried his body, laid it to rest which you referenced Greek tragedy earlier. This is very reminiscent of Antigone, in which the whole thing is you have to lay the body to rest, otherwise the soul will never be able to lie in the ground. And so, I mean, that whole B-plot with the nun and the burying Freddy's ashes, very inspired by Greek tragedy. But,
as well as just Christian faith.
As well as just Christian faith in general, yes, of course. But it kind of seems like it would be hard to go forward from here. So, or at least with that particular source of horror and element. So I think I'm really intrigued to see what they replace that with, or if they even do try to replace it.
Yeah, so we'll get a little of that in Dream 4, because we're returning to Kristen or Kirsten, I can never remember which, Parker, right? And she's kind of going to be the main character. So we're going to kind of continue some of the narrative. But I think you're right that this film is really sort of bringing a conclusion to at least a chapter of the story. And I want to go back to what you said about the burial and the body, because I think that, again, one of the things this film does more explicitly than the other two, and I'm 100% for it, is this sort of engagement with the more religious aspects. So from the beginning, right, our initial rhyme includes the, grab your crucifix. But this is the film that really sort of plays with the idea of ritual, and this idea that, so I was talking to a Catholic friend. I didn't know this, but Catholics are encouraged to not be cremated because they're supposed to be buried. And so there's a very interesting way in which we're having this burial ritual that feels really sort of as a antithesis to the most famous, at least religiously speaking, burial story, right? That of Jesus. And so there's an interesting way in which we have a resurrection. It just follows a lot of themes
Wait. Freddy Krueger you're making the argument right now that Freddy Krueger is a Christ figure?
No, no. I am making the argument that this film is giving us yet another example of how we can't have these dichotomies, because we have someone in Freddy who, if we're going to continue this, right, is the child of a holy woman, who has the ability to affect the world, whose body has never, who actually in this case has a body as opposed to not having a body to be buried, right? It feels like it's definitely not a Christ figure.
This is the third movie, and he resurrects in this one. He's finally able to go back. Oh my God, Freddy Krueger is a Christ figure, confirmed. That is.
Oh, that sounds so sacrilegious.
But it is what we've just described. What you've just described. This importance of rituals. This idea of he's come back. He's come back, but then he can go. But then he will ultimately be able to ascend up after a period of three. Jesus 3 days. Freddy Krueger 3 movies.
It's terrible. But yeah. Okay. So the part of me that, again, is horrified by this sacrilegious turn that this conversation has taken, is a bit traumatized, but the academic in me is, there is something to be said about how this film is taking everything that we understand and not letting us rest there comfortably. And we haven't even talked about all the, can I just say shout out again to the film in terms of special effects? Yeah. And in terms of just other effects, but the claymation with the puppets, the giant worm-like thing. Did you read about the fact that when they first created the worm-like version of Freddy, that it was way too phallic, because it was just this giant pink thing with a head on the top trying to eat someone, and they just were we only have an hour, so they were let's just throw some green goo on it because we don't have time to make anything new.
That's hilarious. Did not know that, but
so gross.
This I would believe that story from this franchise, and I would believe that story from Evil Dead.
Pretty much.
Those are the only two that could happen with. That's hilarious.
And I know, and it's so gross. Even some of the ones that are a little less practical, although a lot of it's practical, but like the strings, the puppet master moment, or the scene with the boy in the wheelchair and the wizardness, right? Like, there's so much of this film that just does such masterful stuff in terms of the CGI and the special effects that I just have to like glow in it. Like, I think that's why this franchise continues to be watchable, because they aren't relying on exclusively what would have been radical technology for 87 that would have been terrible for today.
Yeah, the effects look good, and for the most part hold up even today. Mm-hmm. The cast is really good, and they got some big names for this. I was watching that opening credits, and I was like, Patricia Arquette, that's an Oscar winner. Lawrence Fishburne.
Yeah.
Then, of course, you've got the return of Heather. Is there any other famous people? Oh, John Saxon's back, of course. I was just impressed by watching it. I was like, wow, they really put together a good cast for this.
Yeah, and this is Arquette's first real role. This is before like Fishburne had become that person that I think everyone wanted to be in their films, because it's just sort of like early in his career. And you're absolutely correct. Like, we have really good acting, we have fun cinematography. I do want to say, if I have one thing that I'm not a fan of in this film, it is the need that we have to give a backstory to our monsters. The giving Freddy the backstory of, how he's the product of, 100+ rapes, which is real intense, and having us have to have that, like, that he is the product of not just rape, but of a bunch of mentally ill people. I know that there's a little bit of that's just kind of continuing the sins of the father motif. But to me, that is the one place where I think this film took away what has been consistently one of its most powerful as a franchise concepts. And that is this idea that we, the system, the quote ordinary system that looks so average on the outside with all of our white picket fences, is capable of helping to create a monster, right? I think that's lost a little bit in this, because it's like, of course he's evil. How could he have been anything but that? And it's like, well, he was evil all along, but also they burnt him alive, right? So I felt like that was something that I think I would be okay with never having another backstory again, period, for any monster ever. Yep, I'm gonna go that big. So that was my one thing. I don't know if it bothered you, because I know sometimes that the backstory is something that bothers you, or if it was just not something you really cared.
I guess because the backstory kind of fit a lot. I guess because they didn't really stay with it for very long, I kind of it didn't offend me. I didn't really care. The B plot, admittedly, is the plot I cared less about. This whole idea of following the nun. Even if I did sometimes like how it contributed to the source of horror in the film, and like some of the elements that it brought, those were always the moments that I liked the least, and when I thought the writing wasn't quite as strong, which was that was the only major problem I had, is just sometimes there was, the writing was pretty stupid. Like, almost everything John Saxon said in this movie made me laugh, but not in the way I think they were intending it.
Yeah.
And just a lot of the scenes, like, when it was found out that the nun was Freddy's mom, just the literal saying of, "You're his mother," as we read the tombstone that has the name on it. Yeah. I'm like, okay, this is a little silly.
Yeah, there was definitely some, like, for the lowest denominator, right? Like, we'll go ahead and put this in case you forgot that her name was Amanda, or forgot that Freddy's last name was Krueger, or just weren't paying attention. And there were several moments in that, and I think you're right, that the ones where we see it most evident are in, Nancy's father and any of those conversations, and then just some of the dialogue with and about.
But other than that, this movie is really fun. This was the first time I think I had really sat down to just watch this movie. I had seen this in like a Nightmare late night watches, like when it would marathon on TV. So I'd seen it like that, or I'd seen bits and pieces of this movie. So I was very, very pleasantly surprised. Yeah, this is not. I don't know if I think only time will tell if I like this movie better than the original, or where it fits within my overall Nightmare ranking. But right now, I'm pretty confident saying I don't think I will ever not like it, and I had a great time with it.
And again, I think the key to success, and we've talked about this before, is to not have a franchise where the next installment is, okay, but how can we go bigger and more blood? It's, okay, but how can we take this idea and twist it just a smidge and then see what happens? And that's what I think Evil Dead has done successfully, and that's what Nightmare is proving to do. Thank you so much for joining us for our discussion of A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors. As is always the case, we will be returning to this franchise, but we will take a brief break so that you can have a palate cleanse. And instead, our next episode will be on
2017's One Cut of the Dead. If you have not seen that film, go ahead and watch it right now in preparation for that episode.
And do not read anything about it, is the advice I've been given.
Yes. Have you seen it yet?
I still haven't seen it. So this
Okay.
is a film that Anthony has been wanting me to watch for a really long time. The other friends were like, you need to watch this now. And I keep putting it off, and I don't know. I think it's because I'm afraid that it won't be, because I accidentally found out a little bit about the film ahead of time, that it's not gonna be as magical for me. But I'm so excited to finally have a reason to watch this film so that we can talk about it.
And I'm excited to talk about it with you as well and share it with all of our listeners. In the meantime, check out our YouTube channel, where we'll be uploading a spooky scrap over Nightmare 3. Also in the description is all of our social medias, so be sure to follow us on there.
And have a spooktacular day.